Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and welcome to this rendition of our conflict briefings series. As many of you will know, the IISS produces something called the Armed Conflict Database, in which we track all the armed conflicts currently taking place around the world. And each month we ask one of our fantastic team of analysts to give a briefing on one of their conflicts. And this month it is the turn of Eleanor Beevor, who is our research analyst for Central Africa in general. She covers the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Central African Republic, and as of recently also Cameroon, and in the past studied Somalia. And speaking with her will be our Senior Fellow for Conflict Security and Development and the editor of the Armed Conflict Survey, Francesca Grandi. Now, the Central African Republic garners very little attention, particularly in the UK, but the conflict has been going on since December 2012, so it's some 6.5 years old now. And in February, a peace agreement was signed of some sort. So I'd like to begin by asking Nella about the peace agreement, which the main parties to the conflict have signed, and that sounds pretty significant.
Thank you very much. Yes, so it's been an interesting few weeks watching the aftermath of the peace agreement, but this was a peace agreement that needed doing over twice. So the groundwork for this peace agreement began last year, and it was two series of negotiations that then became collapsed into one under the African Union Initiative for Peace and Reconciliation in the Central African Republic. But the formal negotiations began in January, and the official declaration, the official peace agreement was signed on February the 6th in Bangui. So yes, you're right. The signatories include the country's 14 major armed groups, as well as the Central African government. And it is significant to get 14 armed groups to agree on absolutely anything. So it's no mean feat that it's not an insignificant achievement. Unfortunately, the way that they did that was by shrouding a lot of the core tenets of this agreement in ambiguity. So the contents of the peace agreement is really it's a pretty radical political makeover for the CAR, encapsulated in a 30-page document.
So what is in the agreement? What are the main things the parties have agreed on?
Quite a few things, but there's two or three significant ones that stand out. The first one is a decentralization plan. There's also a Justice and Reconciliation Commission and an inclusive government. Now, the decentralization could either be a positive or a negative thing for the CAR, depending on how it's done. But from the contents of the peace agreement, we really don't know very much about the mechanism for it or how that would come about. The touchy one was, of course, the inclusive government. So this was meant to be a power-sharing agreement with the leaders, with senior representatives from these 14 armed groups. But it appears that when it was signed, there was no formal agreement about who would get representatives or how many. So on March the 3rd, when the new Prime Minister who was picked for the agreement, Ferman Grebada, announced the contents of the new cabinet, he unveiled 4 ministerial positions allocated to armed groups, and the armed groups that those were allocated to have a loose coalition that covers most of Central and Western CAR. However, the rest of the armed groups didn't get ministerial positions, and some weren't allocated any positions at all. And along with that, the core government that had preceded this one hadn't changed very much. So the results of that were fairly predictable. Rebel groups took instant action. One, the FDPC of Abdoulaye Miskin, blockaded the route between the main trading route between Cameroon and Bangui, with the very quick result of food prices skyrocketing. Then the groups that had actually been allocated positions started demanding more, saying that because they controlled the most territory, they should be given more positions. So the African Union was forced to rush into a second round of talks in order to save the agreement. And the upshot of these was that every single armed group was allocated, if not a ministerial position, then an advisory position, either to the president, to the prime minister, or to the military. Which has led to some strange results, including 3 notorious rebel leaders now being military advisors in the areas where they have had a very heavy hand in destabilising over the course of the past few years. But the other kind of key aspect of this peace agreement is justice and accountability. So the Central African people made it very clear that they would not accept any agreement that didn't have some sort of component to ensure accountability. And so as part of that agreement, there is a Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission that's supposed to begin work within 3 months of the agreement being signed. However, the powers of that Truth and Reconciliation Commission, its mandate and its ability to prosecute, is yet to be decided, and it's going to be decided by a quote-unquote inclusive council that will include leaders of armed groups, and these are the same armed group leaders that that were saying during the negotiations they would not accept any agreement that didn't guarantee them amnesty. There isn't actually an amnesty law in this agreement, but what there is a discretionary clause allowing President Touadéra to grant amnesty to people he sees fit, even those who've been convicted by special criminal courts. So there's not much real hope here for serious change in regard to past impunities.
So it sounds as if this peace agreement is a process of sharing out government positions among armed groups to stop them from fighting, and a rather toothless justice and reconciliation process. But with this new Truth and Reconciliation Commission, how does this sit with all the existing institutions that come from previous peace agreements?
Right, thank you. Well, transitional justice in the Central African Republic is a challenge, and the President is clearly trying to implement this very difficult balancing act between popular demands for justice and the armed groups' request for impunity and amnesty. So what is happening is that first of all, the peace agreement does not mention any of the specifics of how impunity can be fought, although in its preamble it actually restates the principle of fighting against impunity. But it doesn't even mention the mechanisms that are in place. And these are the National Criminal Court. For example, in January 2018, the first trial of an anti-Balaka leader took place, and General Agilio was sentenced to life imprisonment. That was, of course, a positive step in the right direction, but it was just one, and the process has been very slow. The other mechanisms that exist is the Special Criminal Court that was created under the transitional government in 2015 and inaugurated in October 2018. It's a court with jurisdiction over grave violations of human rights and war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The investigations have just started at the beginning of this year, so it remains to be seen what the court will be able to accomplish. Of course, one major challenge it faces is that pledges of funding has been made for the first 14 months, but the budget to operate the court for 5 years is over 40 million euro. So it's not clear how that will be met. It also faces a challenge of obscurity in a way, because people are not quite aware that it exists, and it's difficult to reach out people in the outer region to have them report to the court and bring forward their testimonies. just one very charming detail that I'd like to mention is that there is a program funded by the EU, by the way, which is for a theatre company to actually go around the country and enact plays that talk about the special court. And I thought there was a brilliant way of publicizing its functions. And people are getting involved, and it's clear from their reaction that it does cater to the demands for justice from the population, but it of course remains to be seen how much it will be able to deliver on those. And then of course there is the ICC in The Hague, which has started a proceeding against two anti-Balaka leaders, both one arrested in Bangui in October, and then brought to The Hague, and the other arrested in Paris in November. And so the trials will start soon. The hearings have already the reading of the counts of accusations have already been started. So also that remains to be seen how it will proceed.
Okay, so in balance with these four different judicial systems, the National Criminal Court, the Special Criminal Court, the ICC, and this new Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in the eyes of Central Africans, is this going to meet the demands for justice?
Well, look, in a recent interview, the vice president of the Constitutional Court in Bangui said that the population sees the judicial system as a whole as too complex, too formal, too distant, and too slow in addressing their needs. So there is a major challenge ahead.
Okay.
And of course, as Eleanor was saying, how the Truth Commission will be structure will be fundamental in this endeavor.
Okay. So we've spoken at some length about the peace agreement, but perhaps let's just go backwards a moment. Why are the parties fighting? What has led CAR to this point?
It's a long story. So the post-Seleka crisis that sort of dated from 2013 onwards it's characterised as a crisis in its own right, which isn't strictly true. It's more like a more intense period of cycles that the CAR has been in for far longer, in that it's been several years since it's experienced low-level conflict that is exacerbated by a very weak and occasionally predatory state. The CAR is often characterised as a religious conflict, which again isn't really true, and certainly wasn't until very late in the conflict. However, there were historical divisions in place that kind of helped lay that groundwork. And so one of these is a major north-south divide. So the CAR is a massive territory. And the far north is completely inaccessible from the south for about 6 months of the year, owing to the rains. So the south is generally Christian and speaks Sango, whereas the north is more predominantly Muslim, and the northern territories are a lot more heavily influenced by their Muslim neighbours, including Chad and Sudan. So that leads to a strong discrimination against northerners in the south by southern Central Africans, who have a tendency to see northern Central Africans as foreigners. And since independence, there's also been very little in the way of democratic transitions. Power has almost ubiquitously been taken by force, often making use of external influences as well. So the first democratically elected president, Félix Pétasse, who was elected in 1993, was ousted about 10 years later by his own chief of staff, François Bozizé. And Bozizé himself then spent 10 years in power, but he quickly started making enemies, and rebel groups began gathering in the north. And so the key rebel leader that we have to think about here is Michel Yotodia. He, in 2012, was looking for allies to try and depose Bozizé, And so he restyled his rebel group as the Seleka, which means coalition in Sango. So he opened it up to everyone who had a grudge against Bozize, who was a political opportunist, and a lot of Chadian mercenaries joined as well. And then once they took the northern city of Nzele, a lot more Central Africans began joining the movement. And then they marched south, and they took Bangui in March 2013. The problem was that Diotodia couldn't then control the force that had effectively made him president. All of these troops had had very little in the way of political commonality before that started, and then this massive campaign of looting and abuses by the Seleka troops began, and there was very little Diotodia was able to do. And then the victims of the Seleka violence in the south, but also especially in the west, began to identify their assailants more and more by regionalism and by religion. So they began to see them as northern Muslims and defined themselves in religious terms as well. So then self-defense units known as the Anti-Balaka began springing up, and they occasionally identified as Christian or as animist, but predominantly as anti-Muslim units. And so the cycle of violence gained a new wave. And the Anti-Balaka became progressively more organised, and they began to attack Bangui in December 2013. And this forced Diotodia, the president, to flee to Chad, where he was persuaded to step down by the Chadian president Idriss Déby. They arranged for a transitional government to take Diotodia's place, which was led by Catherine Samba Panza. And then elections were organised in March 2016, which brought the current president Touadéra to power. But in the meantime, the ex-Seleka forces had left Bangui and splintered into a number of different rebel groups that took most of the north, the east and the centre of CAR. And so far, with a weak state and a largely weak army, Touadéra has not been able to either reverse the power of those rebel groups or bring stability to the country. And what's even more confusing is that the Seleka and Anti-Balaka, formerly enemies, now periodically align themselves and form loose coalitions of alliances. These alliances are always driven by very short-term interests, but partnerships and alliances are constantly fracturing.
So it's quite a complicated picture and narrative. And as I understand it, you see it as a number of overlapping conflicts.
Definitely, and I would say Eleanor did a very good job in simplifying an overly complex situation. But I think a very useful way of thinking about the CAR conflict is as the result of overlapping of many different conflicts. So there is definitely the center versus the periphery grievance, which then takes on religious and ethnic overtones, but there are also intercommunal dynamics, which of course get colored by this overarching fault line. At the same time, there is a self-sustaining political economy that has been created within the country, and between the country and the cross-border neighbors, by which armed groups mostly are interested in controlling trade and traffic routes and making sure that they call the shots within the territories that they oversee, because that brings them revenues and brings them the possibility of paying their foot soldiers.
Okay, so the illicit economy is quite a central part of the conflict.
Absolutely. Both the licit and illicit, actually. Okay. So, for example, Central African Republic is a major producer of diamond and gold, but the proportion of these natural resources that are put into commerce via legal means is a fraction of the production that actually exists. For example, diamonds, the production capacity is around 300,000 carats per year, and the quantity that gets commercialized via legal means was 75,000 in 2018, but that was actually a backlog of production that could not be commercialized in the previous years because of the conflict. So really, the legal commercialization of diamonds in 2018 was about 10,000 carats, which is a small fraction, of course, of the 300,000. The gold extraction is picking up pace, mostly due to the fact that the diamond mining has suffered a setback. Partly for two main reasons. One is that the Kimberley Protocol led to many buying houses to leave the country. So there is less of an opportunity to actually commercialize the diamonds via legal means. But also because the violence led many Muslims to flee. And Muslims are overrepresented within the business of commercializing diamonds. So these two factors led to a decrease of diamond production, and now the country is focusing more on the gold production, both the state and the armed groups.
Okay, and as I understand it, cattle are also an important part of the illicit and illicit economies.
Absolutely, cattle is a fundamental part of the socioeconomic landscape in Central African Republic. Armed groups made money out of the cattle business, both by taxing the routes that the trade of cattle needs to operate within the country and within the neighbors, but also by owning cattle. So there are quite a few leaders within armed groups that became themselves businessmen. Also, it's a very important aspect of the cattle business is also overlapping with one of the dynamics of the conflict, because the Fulani community is overrepresented in the cattle business because they tend to be herders, and so they are both targeted as victims of the violence, but at the same time they're also targeted by the taxation by the armed groups.
Okay. There's a lot of external involvement in the Central African Republic. Is that connected with this economic potential of CAR?
Yes and no. There's all sorts of overlapping interests in CAR, and there's a lot of interested parties who have their own reasons for keeping involved in the conflict. I think one thing that sometimes gets slightly missed about CAR, there's a regular idea that it does have hundreds of thousands of very valuable resources, and there's a degree of paradox in that it should be a very rich country. And it's slightly more complex than that, in that extracting those resources, certainly for official international companies, would be an extremely difficult and extremely expensive process. Excuse me. So there's, the CAR has 1,300 kilometres worth of paved roads and 20,000 worth of unpaved roads. And most of those 20,000 are again inaccessible for 6 months of the year due to the rain. And the insecurity and the lack of infrastructure means that straightforward of extraction of resources by larger, more formal companies is not quite as easy a prospect as it's sometimes made to sound. But that hasn't stopped a lot of international involvement for all sorts of reasons. I'll quickly skip through some of the regional and some of the more international players. So the two sort of big regional players that have been most involved are Chad and Sudan. So for Chad, President Idriss Deby is very concerned by the history of Chadian militant groups, of which there are quite a few, using CAR soil to launch attacks against his own regime. So he understandably wants a friendly government in Bangui nip that in the bud, and also is concerned about keeping his own militants on his own turf as busy as possible. So that partly explains some of his own involvements in CAR. Sudan is going to be an interesting player to watch in the CAR conflict. So President Bashir is believed to have funded the early stages of Seleka and has also provided them with weapons. However, the ex-Seleka militant groups are still very likely getting, are still believed to be getting weapons from Sudan, specifically from Sudanese traffickers who have managed to exploit arms deposits caused by arms laydowns in Darfur. The other interesting aspect to watch is what's going to happen now that President Bashir's been deposed, and that obviously slightly depends on who takes power next and what they and how friendly they are to which parties in the CAR. But it's worth noting that there are reports that some of the ex-Seleka signatories to the agreement, especially Abdoulaye Hissène of the FPRC, felt that al-Bashir was a sort of moral guarantor of this peace agreement, and so they may be more hesitant to stay in it if they don't see his continued involvement. Meanwhile, we've got a lot more international players. Obviously, the European Union and especially France continue to maintain a lot of activity in CAR. The EU training mission has trained 4,000 Central African Republic forces so far. And France has also recently attempted to step up deliveries of weapons to those Central African forces by trying to get exemptions to the arms embargo. This appears to be largely in response to growing Russian influence in CAR. I think it's fair to say that Russia is now the most influential player in Bangui. Moscow has been very vocal about wanting to broaden its influence in Africa, certainly over the past 2 years. But the CAR is the most advanced of its new partnerships. So as well as having sent so far over 7,000 light weapons, Russia has also sent it's now 260 military instructors, and a high number of those are believed to be private military contractors from the Wagner firm. So these personnel are known to be training Central African armed forces, guarding mining sites and hospitals, and Russian personnel also make up a proportion of President Touadéra's presidential guard. And Touadéra's government, by all accounts, has been very happy to accept Russian assistance, and he's appointed a Russian national as one of his national security advisors. So that partnership doesn't look likely to fade anytime soon, and it's going to be decisive in the next stages of the conflict.
Okay, and one of the external actors not mentioned so far is, of course, the UN and the MINUSCA mission. So how would you assess the performance of MINUSCA in CAR?
Well, MINUSCA faces many challenges. Established in 2014, he has a personnel of about 15,000, including 11,000 military and 2,000 police. And its mandate, it's quite robust. It centers on protection of civilians. There is a strong mandate to support the process of demobilization and disarmament. It's in charge of supporting the expansion of the state and the reach of the state in the outer regions. And also, of course, it needs to support the SSR, the security sector reform process. So the challenges come pretty much from all angles. So at the local level, the UN has not been able to really change the balance of power on the ground, especially in the center and the east of the country. So it's still very much the target of ambushes and attacks, and so it's actually taking heavy casualties for the standards of the UN. To date, 82 peacekeepers have been killed. What is also struggling to do is to reach out at the local level and to permeate the communities in the outer region. So it's making an effort to strengthening local peace agreements, local ceasefires, local non-aggression pacts, but the resources are limited for that, and so very often it gets targeted by armed groups who of course do not want opposing communities to come together and resolve their issues in a peaceful manner. The challenge comes also from the Security Council, because the Security Council is divided over Central African Republic. The US is tired to pay the bill, and it certainly does not want the bill to increase, which is something that France would probably like, because France is suggesting that the UN supports alternative security partners in the country, and so that would of course add to the bill of the mission, which the US is more and more reluctant to approve. There was in November a standoff within the council, because Russia opposed the draft resolution proposed by France, whose language explicitly said that the only official peacemakers could be the UN and the EU, denying Russian and Sudan efforts in trying to bring the actors together. So there is a lot of friction there as well, and there not have been signs that those frictions have actually been resolved.
Okay. So you mentioned that France would like to see the MINUSCA mission to expanded to support alternative security partners. Could you expand a little there?
Yeah, for example, France is very keen on making the success of the regional counterterrorism initiative, the G5 Sahel, succeed, and is envisioning probably more and more something similar operating in the CAR, because is growing skeptical that the UN is actually able to take on the security challenge that the armed groups pose. Okay. So there is nothing on the table, but let's say that the mood is more toward alternative arrangements, given the challenges that MINUSCA is facing.
Okay. Thank you to you both so far. I'd like to invite questions from yourselves. So if you could raise your hand or just catch my eye when I ask you to speak, provide your name and your affiliation. And while you think of questions...
there are questions.
Oh, there are questions. Okay, there we go.
So I'm Tony Sampaio from the IISS. Often these peace agreements tend to be equated with political talks between political hierarchical structures. So the government and the armed groups, the leaderships of the armed groups, and there is demobilization, political incentives, transitional justice. These things tend to benefit a lot the hierarchical structures, including the non-state ones, but the underlying governance and political economies that you've also mentioned tend to stay pretty much unchanged. Now, you've mentioned a little bit about decentralization. Specifically, decentralization, I think, is, as you said, is still unknown, but seems to me like something that is hinting a bit more towards the local governance mechanism. So, but even going beyond the peace process, is there anything being done? Is the UN presence there trying to tackle these issues of local governance and the political economies and trying to replace them with some legal and state governance mechanisms?
Okay, who wants to tackle that?
I can start. I think you've summed up the problem in one of the peace agreements. Certainly, this is one of the perpetual failures of the format of these peace agreements. There have been quite a few so far, and what we keep coming back to is that while the leadership certainly benefits, and occasionally rank and file soldiers benefit from the fruits of a DDR program, the rank and file soldiers are generally left out. The chains of commands in some of these non-state armed groups do vary, but a lot of them are very weak. So if the rank and file do not have incentives with which to stop fighting, then there's no reason why they will. And actually the difficulty and the tragedy within CAR is that fighting has so far been the most effective way to get any attention from the state. Frankly, the state is a bit of a paradox. It's not very interested in trying to impose its own governance over the more peripheral regions of the country. So there's plenty of very good interviews by scholars of the CAR who interview people caught in this bind. What do I do? You know, do I start fighting and cause more instability when actually what I want is the sort of stability that the state should in theory be providing? And so the decentralization may be, I think, some form of decentralization is probably the best answer to that. The question is, what form is it going to take, and will it become a further vehicle of patronage that will benefit armed groups and state elites, as has been known to happen in plenty of other countries? I hope not, but there needs to be a much firmer roadmap as to how that's going to work. But Francesca,
and for sure also how the central government can support its representatives in the periphery, because this is also a very key point. Armed groups do effectively run parallel administrations. I would add just 2 points to what Eleanor said. One is that DDR programs need to be accompanied, of course, by socioeconomic a new vision of how to take away the incentives for youth and for the population in the outer region to actually join the armed groups. And at the moment, there is not much of an alternative than being involved in illicit activity, or if you are a young unemployed male, possibly to join an armed group. So there is not much of a vision for what all these alternatives should be. And there is not really much of that in the UN mandate either, which has been very heavily focused on the security and the military aspect of the problem. Granted, that of course is needed, but it is kind of a giant with very fragile feet if he doesn't have this process accompanying it. And the other point is that there are initiatives going on at the local level. What I was mentioning before, sort of very localized mediation processes and peace processes, but these are not incorporated or integrated into an overarching national strategy, and so there is no self-reinforcing mechanisms going back and forth between the two, and so they become sort of very short-lived. Even if they work at the beginning, there is not much in terms of supporting them. And a very specific and important aspect of this is that the armed groups' activity has deteriorated the authority of traditional chiefs, which are inbuilt solutions for resolving disputes. So these are somehow natural allies whose ability of bringing communities together should be leveraged more.
Please.
Hi, I'm Wajaden Ottawa, and I'm with the African Leadership Centre at King's College. And my question kind of ties into what you have been saying just now, but it particularly has to do with the role of youth in this conflict. And I think a lot of the coverage is spoken about youth as actors within the conflict, and I'm interested in youth in terms of the peace-building processes. I want to know whether the peace agreement makes any provisions for the inclusion of youth in, the post-conflict process, and whether you can comment on, the local initiatives that you described, because from the very little research I've done at the moment, it seems as though youth actors are operating in very localized ways, but there are very few vertical linkages, and where they do exist, it's often with external actors, so the EU or the UN, etc. So can you comment on vertical linkages where they exist, and also the importance of horizontal linkages amongst the community and other youth actors as well?
Cool. I'll start from this last point, possibly. What I would say about that is that you're completely right. The vertical linkages are are barely there, in the sense that the civil society organizations that, for example, exist in Bangui are very Bangui focused, and they have very little knowledge or networks with what is happening outside Bangui. So in a way, it's very interesting, because the idea that the state does not reach out of Bangui pretty much applies to everything in Central African Republic. So that includes civil society organizations besides the state, and so there is clearly a problem of lack of funding, weak capacity in order to overcome these challenges, and of course the infrastructure that simply does not allow to travel outside the capital with ease.
Can I add to that?
Please.
Thank you. It's a critical question, and to my mind, one of the major flaws of this peace process is that it was so exclusive, and in that sense, it failed to build on some more promising initiatives, such as the 2015 Bangui Forum, which did have a much wider set of people involved. It had women actors, it had youth representatives, it had traditional authorities. It had a much more inclusive set of stakeholders, and as a result, they managed to get some very impressive and very wide-ranging commitments out of that agreement. Now, that agreement ultimately broke down, but I think it remains an endorsement of much more inclusive mediation tactics. And to carry on with your point about civil society, a thing that's concerning me at the moment is the fairly heavy-handed response of the government in Bangui to the activities of Bangui civil society groups. So there is a general council of civil society groups in Bangui, and its leader has several times in the last few months called for demonstrations against dishing out political positions to armed groups, but also against infrastructural failures such as the drinking water crisis in Bangui that's affecting a lot of people at the moment. And the response from the administration has been to arrest the leader and to send police onto the streets to stop any demonstrations being fomented. So it doesn't seem like the current government does not seem to be very tolerant of civil expression. So it's hard to see where youth, even the more privileged youth living in the capital, are going to be able to find their political voice. And so it would be terrific to see more vertical linkages using the people who have got a slightly louder voice, but even they are not very able to express themselves at the moment.
Please, I'll take two questions. First and second one.
Jordan Anderson from IHS Market. I just wanted to ask, how do you see the LRA getting along during all of this?
Okay. Shall I start with that one?
Sorry, we'll take the second question.
Yeah. Again, just a quick question on infrastructure. First of all, I'm Remy. I'm from International SOS and Control Risks. Infrastructure, you mentioned that there's a north and south situation, which is something that we see in a lot of different African countries, be it in east or west. In the same sense that Eastern Congo is very much sort of separated from the west. How much of a role could infrastructure on its own play in bridging that divide? Along the lines of building roads and railways and airports and simply or moving the capital to the centre of the country, what difference would that play on its own, or is this purely a sort of a religious and clan conflict?
Sorry, and a third question, Andrew.
So my question was along the lines of, you talked about the sort of chief systems and sort of local conflict sort of processes, and I wonder whether or not there is a question whether or not the import of sort of international standards or systems for conflict resolution should be ignored, and more a Rwanda type model where you actually have people engaged and they form a conflict, pact or discussions amongst themselves using this sort of traditional systems as a way forward. And just quickly, the second question is, how likely is the peace agreement likely to hold, given the situation in Sudan, And are we likely to see, if it does fail, new armed groups forming as well?
Cool.
Okay, so we have a question on the LRA, a question on infrastructure, a question on chiefs and local governance, and international standards for peacemaking, and then how likely is a peace agreement to hold. So why don't you begin, particularly on the LRA?
Sure. So the LRA have been, well, obviously, as we all know, they've been decimated over the years to the point that they're one of the less significant forces, not only in CAR but in DRC. They are nevertheless still pretty vicious. There's been a series of attacks on the city of Obo, which is in the far southeast of the CAR. And what's quite striking in the patterns of violence that are attributed to the LRA, it's very difficult to get a kind of definitive identification of who did what, but it matches their pattern of fairly sporadic killing and abduction. There were several incidents of people being killed for no apparent reason, of civilians being killed, and then a number of abductions in relatively small numbers following those. What I would say about that violence is fairly transient. It crops up in certain places for a few days, for a few weeks, and then dies down again. So it goes to sort of corroborate the analysis that the LRA units, which are fairly disparate at the moment, are constantly on the move. So they're not a very settled group at the moment, as far as I can see.
Thoughts on infrastructure?
Yeah. It's an interesting one. There was so the UN panel of experts wrote in their report that I think it was, I can't remember if it was MINUSCA funded, but there was a new cattle market built in central CAR that was supposed to be a kind of divergence from a way of diverging from the armed group's stranglehold over the cattle trade. So the funny thing about growing the formal economy is that the informal one then grows with it and sort of piggybacks on the back of that. So it's nice to think that growing the formal economy and building new infrastructure will dampen illicit economies, and in practice that's very rarely true. So the example of that cattle market, locals were very grateful for it. They were happy that they didn't have to pay taxes to armed groups when they were selling their cattle at the market. Unfortunately, the armed groups responded to that by setting up illegal checkpoints along the roads leading to the market, so that they were then able to obtain levies from those. So, yeah, new infrastructure is generally a positive thing, and certainly the Central African Republic would be very keen to have more of it. But if anyone can find the solution of how to dampen the illicit responses to it, they'll be very much in demand, but I'm not sure what that is or who's going to come up with it.
Yeah, I think an important point to add to that is yes, it is important to build a road that is functional, but that will not bring benefit if you are not able to control the road and keep it free. And this, of course, comes with a different approach to what is the revenue for the state. Because it is true that armed groups tax all the business that pass through the roads, but the same is true for the state. So the state, it's actually a quite distinct division of sphere of controls, because the state in the south and in the southwest does control the trade routes and does tax transporters and commerce that goes through those routes, and extract quite a bit of revenues from those activities. So probably there is an additional layer that is needed, so that the road is not so fundamental anymore, because it attracts the need for revenues.
Your thoughts on Andrew's question about chiefs and local governance, and local mechanisms and how that sits with international standards for peacemaking.
Yes, I actually had thoughts about his last question as well, which you ended by asking whether we should expect more armed groups to emerge. I will start from that, if you don't mind. Absolutely yes, because as Eleanor made it quite clear, I believe, in her initial presentation, again, this is one peace agreement that, like many others, make it clear that in order to extract benefits from the state, it is quite lucrative to take up arms in Central African Republic.
Can I bounce off of that before you go to the next? Sure. There's, absolutely. And to address your question, will it hold? It's already showing signs of fraying. There's been a lot of violence in Western CAR over the past 2 weeks, believed to have been caused by the UPC, which is one of the major Fulani groups. And that's just one example. There's plenty of other incidents. The FDPC seems to be acting as a bit of a spoiler group at the moment and has so far refused to come on board with the agreement, despite being invited with a ministerial position. So there's, I think, the sort of the fatal flaw of this peace agreement was where, and I guess there wasn't much anybody could have done differently. But as soon as the first government was announced and then rebels began clamouring for more, their demands were met extremely quickly within the space of a couple of weeks. So I fear this has sent a signal that government is there for the taking if you act as a spoiler.
And we saw this coming up as a major challenge to the demobilization programs as well, because the DDR programs are set to address a certain number of actors, and as they start being implemented, and the delays in implementation have been quite numerous and quite grave, but at the same time, by the time they get implemented, they already are starting to become obsolete because there are many other groups that exist that they are not included in the program. And one further important development after the Seleka anti-Balaka split sort of started to splinter into many other groups is that many self-defense groups were formed throughout the country, and many of these are extremely localized. So yes, we talk about 16 major armed groups, but experts say that probably if we count the very, very small and localized one, we are looking at something about 100.
Okay, I have 2 questions there, so we'll take them both.
So, Ignacio Torres from Regent University. Thanks for bringing on this conversation. So, I agree with you that the necessary nuances to capture a faithful picture of the country are highly complex and probably require like a 1-month session. So, from this. So, I won't ask you about the details of the conflicts. So, the Fulani are a Muslim group present in several countries across mainly Central Africa. And for those of you who have spent some time in Africa, within other communities, the Fulani are known for being like very skillful traders. And historically, sources of dispute stemming from this community are usually of an economic basis. However, in the case of the CAR, and as a result of the rise of the anti-Balaka, the process of radicalization of the Fulani is becoming more and more something of a very strongly religious side, right? And this is something that I consider particular of the country. Now, taking this into consideration, I just wanted to ask if you are exploring if there's any sign of any influence of jihadist influence coming into the country, trying to capture these Fulani communities that are increasingly becoming radicalized. And then very much connected to this question, I was glad to hear when you, Federica, mentioned, Francesca, you mentioned this endeavor from MINUSCA as a proxy for France to enable and empower regional security actors, what is actually nowadays known within the UN as the operationalization of the chapter 7.5, so between the use of force and the regional arrangements. I see in this particular context the need from the international community to avoid what happened in the north of Mali, right? Because it tends to, the conflict sort of tends to go in that direction, especially in the north of the country. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to ask what's your stand on this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't have a question actually. I'm Tristan Fabiani from the French Embassy. Just would like to react on a few points you made during your very interesting presentation. So maybe that you answer the question maybe.
No, please.
Okay. So first of all, as you mentioned, France strongly supports the presence of the MINUSCA in Central Africa. It is obvious, but we are not really of the view that the format, the number of the blue helmets should be increased at the moment. We rather think that within the current mandate and format, we should try and further the means to enable the MINUSCA to operate more efficiently when it can, because it faces, as everyone knows, huge security challenges and is not always able to react swiftly. In the long run, we are of the view that it is not MINUSCA who is going to provide a solution to what's happening in the car, but that it is the ability for the Central African authorities to regain control of their own territory. That is why we are pushing hard within the European Union to boost the process of training the Central African Armed Forces and to develop a civilian component of this mission, which has been enacted a few months ago at the European Council to train the internal security forces and the police. Beyond that, obviously what is the core issue is the political one, as is the case in Mali, and we are supporting the political agreement, and that is also one of the reasons made very clear by our minister when he visited the country in December, I think it was, why we think some of the Russian initiatives are very counterproductive insofar as they are not always cooperative. For example, when they organized a parallel track at a time when the African Union was about to produce an agreement, and within the borders of the country, one of the main issues is obviously the fact that the training provided at political and security level by the Russians is targeted on very narrow national interests. So that was raised by our minister when he visited the country, and it explains why there were some disagreements within the Security Council regarding the role of Russia.
Thank you very much for that.
Would you like to respond to Monsieur Fabien's points and also to Ignaz's questions about the influence of the Fulani and avoiding what has happened in northern Mali?
Sure. So, to answer your question quickly, have we seen signs of jihadist ideology affecting the Fulani community? Personally, I haven't. I monitor this conflict pretty regularly for the database, and so far I haven't come across any reports of that, or certainly none recently. I know that there was one historical attempt by an ex-Seleka faction to try administering a territory according to Sharia law, but it broke down quite quickly. I haven't seen any other signs thus far. There's a caveat to that, which is that media coverage and media penetration of the CAR is not strong, so it is impossible to know everything that's going on. So that we haven't seen it so far doesn't suggest that it's impossible. But yeah, I haven't got any evidence to suggest that that's a major problem at the moment.
Just to add to that, to the point you made about from a business conflict becoming more of a religious one, I would disagree with that. I think the religious language is used. I am not sure the Fulani herders and businessmen believe and see that in that way. I think for them it's still very much a problem of business, and they do suffer of the contradiction of armed groups portraying themselves as the protector of the business and the herders, but at the same time extracting very often unreasonable taxes from them. So I do believe that the worry is still more on that side rather than, of course, then the community becomes a means of protecting yourself if you are involved in intercommunal violence. So you do adopt that language, but I do not believe is really the driver of the confrontation.
I largely agree with what Francesca's saying, and I think a further piece of evidence of that is some of the alliances that these groups regularly make with certain factions of the anti-Balaka. Those are not by any means perpetual or trusting alliances, but they are temporary convergences of convenience, and it seems to me that short-term convenience and maximising of political and economic interest is the predominant driver of this conflict at the moment. To respond just quickly to your comparison about northern Mali, that is true. There is, I think there's a comparison to be made there, and certainly the FPRC has had a secessionist desires in the past, not necessarily of an Islamist nature per se, but certainly they've been very ambiguous in the political process about committing to armed forces redeployment in their territory, and also about what future governance over that territory will look like. And I think when push comes to shove, they are not going to let go of their hold over that territory without a probably very unpleasant struggle. There is, I fear there is a likelihood of a separate region maintaining its existence, if not officially, then at least in practice for the foreseeable future. Thank you very much. So those were. It's always very useful to have those clarifications. Just to add to your point about the EUTM civilian component training the police, that's absolutely necessary. There's a chronic shortage of policing in the CAR. One thing that is worth bearing in mind going forward on that front is that 85% of the CAR's police are currently based in Bangui, and that's mostly down to a lack of resources and a lack of vehicles and a lack of means to get themselves further across the country and to maintain any authority there. So that's something that has to be addressed in parallel.
Okay, well, we've run to the end of our hour, so but before I thank Nella and Francesca, I'd like to let you know of the next event in this series of conflict briefings is on Sudan's long walk to democratic transition, what is next, and that takes place on the 17th of May. Also next week, on Wednesday the 1st, we have an event on South Asian security, assessing South Asia security risks, opportunities and prospects, and on Thursday an event on Venezuela, examining the political crisis and the road ahead. And then on 16th of May we have an event exploring the links between slavery and conflict, but you can find the details of all of those events on the IISS website. Please do send us your feedback on the event or come and chat to us afterwards, and I'll conclude by thanking you for coming, and thank you very much to Francesca and to Nella for their talk today.
Thank you.